You want to do what?
I want to work here as a cleaner, Dad. No name, no title. Nobody can know I'm your son.
Collins, you are the heir to a company worth billions of dollars. Why would you?
Because I need to know which woman would love me with nothing before I ever offer her everything.
3 days later, wearing a stranger's uniform and carrying a mop instead of a company badge, the future CEO of one of the largest companies in the country walked through his own front doors, and nobody recognized him. What he was about to discover would change 3 women's lives forever, and it would end with a proposal nobody saw coming. A billionaire's son put on a stranger's uniform, picked up a mop, and walked into his own company as a nobody, because he needed to know one thing before he ever risked his heart. Would anyone still choose him if he had nothing at all to offer them? What he found in that building over the next month would break his heart once, heal it completely, and end with a woman he loved having no idea until the very last moment exactly who she had fallen for. Charles Whitmore was not a man people ignored. When he walked into a room, conversations quieted and postures straightened, because everyone in that building understood exactly what his presence meant. He was the founder and chief executive of Whitmore Industries, a company he had built from nothing over the course of 31 years, alongside his wife, Diane. Today their names sat on office towers, warehouses, and shipping fleets across 4 states. Their signatures alone could move markets, and their decisions shaped the livelihoods of thousands of employees who had never once spoken to either of them directly. But long before any of that existed, Charles and Diane had known what it meant to go without, and neither of them had ever fully let go of that memory, no matter how far they had traveled from it. There were winters, decades earlier, in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in a small town outside Cleveland, when Charles and Diane split a single can of soup between them and called it dinner without complaint. Charles had tried and failed at 2 separate businesses by the time he turned 28, and there were nights he sat at their small kitchen table doing math that never once worked out in his favor, staring at numbers that seemed determined to prove him a fool for dreaming as big as he had. Diane never once suggested he give up, not when the landlord knocked twice in 1 week, not when he came home smelling of a factory shift he had taken just to cover the difference. She believed in a version of him that hadn't happened yet, and that belief, more than any loan or investor, was the only capital they truly had in those years. It was Diane who suggested, after his second failed venture, that Charles stop trying to build something enormous and instead build something small and honest first, a modest logistics service moving freight for local manufacturers who could not afford the larger firms. It was a humble idea, unglamorous and slow, but it worked, because Charles ran it the way Diane had always run their household, with discipline, patience, and an almost stubborn refusal to cut corners. Within a decade, that modest freight service had grown into Whitmore Industries, and within 2 decades, it had become one of the largest privately held logistics and manufacturing companies in the Midwest. Charles never forgot the apartment above the laundromat, and he never let his son forget it either. What Charles and Diane built together over those 31 years eventually became something enormous, but nothing they owned meant as much to them as their only son, Collins. Collins had spent the last 6 years working abroad in London, first in a junior finance role and later helping manage the European division of a firm his father had quietly invested in years before Collins had even applied for the job, a fact Collins did not learn until much later and did not entirely appreciate when he did. He had grown into a serious, watchful young man who noticed things other people missed, a trait his mother liked to say he inherited directly from her, and a trait that would matter more than either of his parents realized in the weeks ahead. Now, at 31, Collins was finally coming home to take his place at the head of the company his parents had spent their lives building, and both of them were thinking, quietly and separately, about the next chapter neither had said aloud yet. On the evening before Collins was set to land, Charles sat across from Diane at their kitchen table, a table far finer than the one they had once done hard math on, though Diane still kept a chipped mug from that old apartment in the back of a cabinet no one else ever opened. Diane set down her coffee and said what had been sitting on her mind for weeks. She told Charles she did not want their son coming home to an empty house and an empty life, that 31 was old enough to be thinking seriously about a family of his own, and that she had waited long enough, in her words, to become a grandmother before she grew too old to properly spoil one. Charles laughed, but reminded her gently that marriage was not something to be rushed for the sake of a timeline, that the wrong person could quietly dismantle a good life from the inside without anyone noticing, until it was too late. Diane told him that was exactly her point. She wanted their son to find someone who would stand beside him the way she had stood beside Charles through years, that offered no guarantee of ever amounting to anything, not someone who simply admired the view from where he now stood after the hardest work was already finished. Charles agreed, and told her there were 3 young women at the company he had personally taken notice of over the past year, each of them sharp, capable, and well regarded within their departments. He said he intended to speak with each of them privately that week, not to arrange anything so formal as an introduction just yet, but simply to see, in his own words, what kind of people they were underneath their job titles and their professional smiles. Diane told him to go ahead, but warned him to be careful, because people rarely show you who they truly are until they believe no one important is watching them do it. Charles told her that was precisely what he intended to find out, though not in the way she expected, and something in the careful way he said it made Diane set down her coffee entirely and study her husband's face for a long moment. She asked him what exactly he meant by that. Charles only smiled and told her she would understand soon enough, once their son was home and had a say in the matter himself. It was the first hint, though Diane did not yet know it, of the unusual plan that would soon reshape 3 young women's lives inside the walls of Whitmore Industries. The next morning, Charles called his longtime executive assistant, Rachel Foster, into his office. Rachel had worked for Whitmore Industries for nearly 15 years and had learned over that time to read her boss well enough to sense when something more than ordinary business was weighing on his mind. He asked her to quietly arrange for 3 employees to come see him separately over the course of the week, 1 from marketing, 1 from accounting, and 1 from the administrative offices. Their names, he told her, were Grace Bennett, Danielle Cross, and Victoria Lane. Rachel wrote the names down without asking why, because in 15 years she had learned that Charles Whitmore rarely explained himself before he was ready, and that he was, without fail, eventually ready. Grace Bennett worked in marketing and was known around the office for being quiet, thoughtful, and almost entirely unmoved by office politics, a rare quality in a building where ambition often announced itself loudly. She had grown up in a small farming town 2 hours outside the city, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a mechanic, and she had worked 2 jobs through college to avoid graduating with debt she could not comfortably repay. She did her work well, treated the janitorial staff with the same courtesy she gave senior executives, and rarely said more than she needed to in any given conversation, preferring to let her work speak on her behalf. Colleagues occasionally mistook her quiet nature for shyness, though anyone who worked closely with her quickly learned it was something closer to quiet confidence. Danielle Cross worked in accounting and was, in nearly every visible way, Grace's opposite. She was loud, funny, endlessly stylish, and entirely unafraid to say exactly what she was thinking in a room full of people who technically outranked her, a boldness that had earned her both admirers and enemies throughout the company. She had grown up the youngest of 5 children in a household where being heard often meant being the loudest voice in the room, and she had carried that instinct with her into adulthood, using humor and confidence as armor against a world she was determined would never overlook her the way she sometimes felt overlooked as a child. She loved good fashion, spoke her mind freely in meetings, and could turn a dull afternoon in the accounting department into something resembling entertainment within minutes. Victoria Lane worked in the administrative offices and was careful, composed, and deeply attentive to how she was perceived by anyone holding real influence within the company, a trait that made her extraordinarily good at her job, and as would later become clear, extraordinarily good at performing kindness whenever it might be observed and rewarded. She had climbed steadily through the administrative ranks over 4 years by making herself indispensable to senior leadership, learning names, remembering birthdays, and anticipating needs before they were spoken aloud. Colleagues respected her competence even as some privately admitted they were never quite certain what Victoria was truly thinking behind her composed, professional smile, a smile that rarely seemed to reach any further than the surface of her face. Victoria had grown up watching her own mother struggle for years after her father left the family with little warning and even less money, and she had decided early on, in the quiet, determined way of a child forced to grow up faster than she should have, that she would never again allow herself to be caught unprepared by circumstances outside her control. That decision had shaped nearly everything about the woman she eventually became, careful, calculating, and always several steps ahead of whatever situation she found herself in, even when the cost of that constant vigilance was a warmth she rarely allowed herself to show unless she believed it might be useful. Charles met with each of the 3 women individually over the course of 2 days, and in each conversation he mentioned, almost casually, that his son Collins was returning home soon, and that his wife had been asking about grandchildren for longer than either of them cared to admit aloud. He watched their faces carefully as he said it, the way a man watches for a tell across a card table. Grace looked mildly amused and told him plainly that marriage was not something 2 people could decide before ever meeting one another, and that if something happened naturally between herself and his son, she would welcome it, and if it did not, she would still be grateful he had thought of her at all. Charles wrote her answer down word for word after she left his office, because it was the only one of the 3 that carried no trace of ambition inside it. Danielle's reaction was very different from the moment Charles finished his sentence. Her eyes widened, and she asked him to repeat himself twice, as though she needed to be absolutely certain she had heard him correctly the first time. By the time she left his office and made her way back down to the accounting department, she was already imagining a version of her life that did not yet exist, one involving expensive cars, a corner office overlooking the city, and a wedding photograph she had, embarrassingly, already begun sketching out in her mind before lunch. She told her roommate, Tasha, that same night that her entire life was about to change, and Tasha, familiar with Danielle's tendency toward dramatic optimism, told her to slow down before she started picking out a venue. Victoria's reaction settled somewhere between the 2 extremes. She thanked Charles warmly, told him that every parent deserved to see their child settled with someone worthy of them, and asked him, in a tone almost too smooth to be entirely sincere, to keep the conversation strictly between the 2 of them for now. Charles suspected that request had less to do with humility and more to do with careful strategy, though he thanked her for her discretion regardless and told her nothing further would happen until his son had actually returned home. He left each meeting with a clearer picture forming in his mind, though he kept that picture entirely to himself for the time being, waiting for his son to arrive before deciding exactly how the next part would unfold. When Collins finally landed at the airport 3 days later, his mother nearly knocked him over hugging him at the arrival's gate, holding on far longer than airport etiquette generally allowed, while his father stood a step back with the kind of quiet pride that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Over dinner that night, surrounded by more food than 3 people could reasonably eat in a single sitting, Diane brought up marriage before Collins had even finished his first plate, prompting Charles to remind her, laughing, that their son had not been home a full day yet, and deserved at least 1 meal without an agenda attached to it. Collins listened to both of them go back and forth with the familiar warmth of a conversation he had missed more than he had let himself admit while living overseas. Eventually, Collins admitted that his father had already told him, over a phone call weeks earlier, about the 3 women from the company his parents had quietly taken notice of, and he told them he had a request of his own in return, one that made both of his parents go still at the same time. Forks paused halfway to their plates. Collins told them he did not want to meet Grace, Danielle, or Victoria as the son of the company's founder, the heir everyone already knew was arriving and already had opinions about before ever exchanging a single word with him. He said that if he walked into that building known publicly as Collins Whitmore, every interaction from that point forward would be shaped, consciously or not, by what people believed he could offer them in return for their attention. He wanted instead to disappear into the company as someone with nothing to give anyone, no title, no last name that meant anything to a payroll department, no future anyone would want to attach themselves to for the wrong reasons entirely. He wanted to become, for a short and carefully controlled period of time, a man named Eli Turner, a new hire in the custodial department, someone whose only real currency inside those office walls would be the way he treated other people, and more importantly, the way they treated him back when they believed there was nothing to gain from being kind. Diane thought the idea sounded reckless at first, and told her son exactly that, listing off every way it could go wrong before Charles had even finished processing the request himself. Charles sat quietly for a long moment before finally saying that it was, in fact, the only truly honest way to find out what his son needed to know before making a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He told Collins that if he was serious about attempting something this unusual, only 4 people in the entire company could ever know the truth of it: himself, Diane, Rachel, and the custodial supervisor, who would need to be told just enough to get Collins properly hired, without asking too many uncomfortable questions along the way. Everyone else in that building, including Grace, Danielle, and Victoria, would have absolutely no idea that the new janitor quietly mopping the lobby floors each morning was the very same man they had all been unknowingly preparing to meet. Collins told his father that was exactly the point of the entire plan. If someone was eventually going to fall in love with him, genuinely and without reservation, he wanted them to fall in love first with a man who owned absolutely nothing at all, a man whose last name meant nothing to a bank, whose future held no guaranteed comfort, and whose only real appeal, if any existed, would have to come from character alone. Diane, though still uneasy about the entire scheme, eventually relented once she saw how firmly her son had made up his mind, and she made him promise, only half joking, that if the plan somehow went badly wrong, he would let his mother handle the fallout personally, since she had, after all, married into a family business built on exactly this kind of stubborn risk-taking. The following Monday, a man calling himself Eli Turner reported to the custodial department of Whitmore Industries, wearing a plain gray uniform 2 sizes too large, carrying a mop bucket instead of the leather portfolio he had used in countless London boardrooms only weeks earlier. The custodial supervisor, a no-nonsense man named Mr. Dawson, had been told only that Eli was a temporary hire brought in as a personal favor to someone in upper management, and he did not ask further questions, because, in his considerable experience, it was rarely wise to push too hard against decisions made several floors above his own. He assigned Eli to the main lobby and reception area, and told him plainly that the building stayed busy from early morning onward, that spills got cleaned up immediately and without complaint, and that no one, regardless of their title or their attitude, got treated with anything less than his full and honest effort. Collins told him he understood completely, and he meant it more sincerely than Mr. Dawson could possibly have known. His first morning on the job introduced him to a version of his own company he had never once seen from the executive floor, a version built entirely out of small, unremarkable moments that most people walking through never bothered to notice at all. He watched employees step casually around wet floor signs without slowing their pace in the slightest, watched some mutter under their breath when asked politely to wait a moment longer before crossing a freshly mopped section, and watched others walk past him entirely, their eyes sliding over him, the way one's eyes slide over a potted plant near the elevators, present but unworthy of any real attention. Grace was the first person that morning to speak to him directly, pausing near the east entrance to ask whether the floor was fully dry yet before she attempted to cross it, and thanking him sincerely when he told her it was. It was a small moment, barely 10 seconds long from start to finish, but Collins noted it carefully in his mind, because it was the very first genuine courtesy anyone in that building had shown him all morning. Later that same day, in the employee cafeteria, Collins sat alone at a corner table with a tray of food he had barely touched, still adjusting to a version of his own workplace, where absolutely no one recognized his face or knew his real name. Grace approached without hesitation, tray in hand, and asked whether she could join him, and when he asked her, half joking, whether she was entirely sure she wanted to be seen sitting with a cleaner in front of her coworkers, she told him plainly that cleaners were people too, and that the question itself said far more about the building's culture than it did about her own decision to sit down. Danielle, seated 2 tables away with a small group of coworkers from accounting, noticed the exchange immediately and made a comment loud enough for half the cafeteria to overhear, asking since when the company started allowing janitors to eat alongside real employees. Grace did not bother responding to her. Collins noticed that silence just as carefully as he had noticed her earlier kindness. Over the following days, a clear pattern began to form that Collins found both illuminating and, at certain moments, genuinely difficult to sit through without reacting. Grace continued treating him with the same steady courtesy regardless of who happened to be watching at any given moment, occasionally bringing him lunch on days she noticed he had skipped eating entirely, and once giving him a ride partway home when a sudden downpour caught the entire building off guard after closing time. Danielle, by contrast, seemed to enjoy testing the outer limits of his patience whenever the opportunity presented itself. Once deliberately knocking a drink onto a section of floor he had just finished mopping and telling him, without a hint of apology in her voice, that spills were simply part of the job description he had signed up for. Victoria's behavior proved by far the most difficult of the 3 to read consistently. In public settings, especially when senior staff happened to be nearby, she occasionally defended him against Danielle's sharper comments, but the moment they found themselves alone, she told him plainly that her public kindness had been performance and nothing more, and that he should be careful not to mistake professional courtesy for anything resembling genuine personal warmth. One afternoon during the second week, Danielle nearly stumbled onto the truth entirely by accident, pausing mid-sentence in the break room when she caught sight of Eli from a certain angle that struck her as oddly familiar, though she could not immediately place why. She mentioned to a coworker that the new janitor reminded her of someone, perhaps an old photograph she had seen once in a company newsletter years earlier, but the thought slipped away from her as quickly as it had arrived, dismissed as an impossible coincidence not worth further consideration. Collins, overhearing the comment from across the room while emptying a trash bin, felt his pulse quicken for the first time since the disguise began, and he made a quiet mental note to be more careful about which hallways he lingered in whenever Danielle happened to be nearby with her sharp, observant eyes. Collins reported each of these small moments back to his parents during quiet evenings at the family house, and Diane, listening closely from across the kitchen table, found herself growing far more invested in the unfolding story than she had ever expected to when her son first proposed this unusual plan. Charles listened mostly in silence during these updates, occasionally asking a clarifying question here or there, but largely allowing his son to draw his own conclusions without steering him toward any particular judgment. 2 weeks into the disguise, Collins told his parents one evening that a single day was never enough time to fairly judge anyone's character, because people could perform kindness or cruelty convincingly for a single afternoon without either performance reflecting who they truly were underneath. What mattered far more, he said, was what people continued doing once that performance became inconvenient, once kindness started costing them something real, or once cruelty had nothing left to gain from staying hidden any longer. That, he told them, was where the truth of a person eventually surfaced on its own. It was during the 3rd week that something shifted meaningfully between Collins and Grace, something neither of them had entirely planned for when this arrangement first began. Grace started saving him a seat at lunch without needing to ask beforehand, and began mentioning entry-level marketing positions she thought he might genuinely qualify for once she learned, almost by accident, that he held a business degree he had never yet had the chance to properly use. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Collins finally worked up the nerve to ask her directly why she continued treating him with the same unwavering warmth regardless of who happened to be watching them together. Grace told him it was simply the only way she had ever known how to treat other people, and admitted she often found it strange that more people did not seem to operate the same way by default. Collins told her, carefully and as honestly as the circumstances allowed, that he was beginning to care about her far more than he had ever expected to when this entire arrangement started weeks earlier. Grace admitted, quietly and without much hesitation, that she felt very much the same way about him, and asked only that they keep whatever was growing between them private for the time being, not out of any shame on her part, but because she genuinely did not want her coworkers turning something that felt real and fragile into another round of office gossip. Their conversations grew longer after that evening, stretching well past the end of official shifts, covering everything from Grace's childhood on her parents' small farm to Collins's carefully edited version of his own past, one that conveniently left out several important details he still was not ready to share with her just yet. Around this same time, Collins found himself stopping by Rachel's office more frequently than the plan strictly required, ostensibly to check on logistics, but really, if he was honest with himself, because he needed someone who knew the truth to talk to about the growing weight of maintaining it. He admitted to her one afternoon that deceiving Grace, even for a reason he still believed was sound, had started to feel less like an experiment and more like a burden he was not entirely sure he had the right to place on her without her knowledge. Rachel, who had watched Charles and Diane build their entire life together on a foundation of hard-won honesty, told him gently that the truth would matter far less in the end than what he did with it once it finally came out, and that Grace struck her, from everything she had observed, as someone who would understand exactly why he had done what he did. One quiet Saturday, Grace invited him to walk through a small farmer's market near her apartment, the kind of ordinary outing Collins had not experienced in years spent moving between boardrooms and business dinners overseas. He found himself genuinely delighted by the simplicity of it, tasting honey samples and arguing playfully with Grace over which variety was best. And for a few hours, he was not the son of Charles Whitmore or even Eli the janitor, just a man enjoying an ordinary Saturday with a woman he was falling for. Grace noticed more than once how naturally he carried himself among strangers, how easily he spoke with vendors and neighbors, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly he had done with his life before landing in a custodial uniform, though she never pressed him for details he seemed reluctant to share. Danielle, however, had grown increasingly suspicious of the closeness developing between Grace and the new janitor, watching their interactions with the sharp attention of someone determined not to be caught off guard by anything happening around her. One afternoon, she secretly recorded a private moment between the two of them near the supply closet on the 3rd floor, capturing enough footage to convince herself she finally held real leverage over her quiet rival. She confronted Grace the very next morning in the hallway outside the accounting department, threatening to show the footage to the entire office unless Grace ended whatever was happening between herself and Eli immediately and permanently. Grace, entirely unshaken by the threat, told Danielle plainly that she had every right to care about whoever she chose to care about, and that if Danielle genuinely wanted to expose anything to anyone, she should go right ahead, because Grace intended to tell Charles Whitmore the full truth herself before Danielle ever got the chance to. Danielle, certain this admission would permanently damage whatever standing Grace still held within the company, followed her that same afternoon all the way to Charles's office, determined to witness the confrontation firsthand, and perhaps add a few unflattering details of her own along the way. Charles listened patiently as Grace explained, without any hesitation in her voice, that she had grown genuinely close to a coworker in the custodial department and no longer wished to be considered for any future introduction to his son. Danielle interjected before Charles could fully respond, adding several exaggerated details Grace herself had never actually offered, clearly hoping to make the entire situation appear far worse than it truly was. Charles calmly asked Danielle to step outside his office so he could speak privately with Grace, and once the door closed behind Danielle, he asked Grace a single question that would matter far more than she yet realized. He asked her, plainly and without any judgment in his tone, whether this man, this Eli, made her genuinely happy, and whether she believed his current circumstances were destined to define the entire remainder of his life. Grace answered honestly, without a moment's hesitation, that she believed in him completely, regardless of what he currently owned or did not own. Charles thanked her sincerely for her honesty, and told her something she would not fully understand until the company's upcoming celebration, an event marking both his own long-awaited retirement and his son's much-anticipated return to lead the company forward. Grace left his office confused but strangely relieved, unaware that the conversation she had just survived would soon change the entire course of her life in ways she could not yet begin to imagine. Word of Grace's confrontation with Danielle spread quickly through the company over the following days, taking on new and increasingly exaggerated details with each retelling, until several employees were convinced Grace had shouted at Charles Whitmore himself in his own office. Rachel, overhearing several versions of the story near the break room, found herself once again biting back a knowing smile, aware of a much larger truth that made all the gossip feel almost comical by comparison. Mr. Dawson, catching wind of the rumors involving his own custodial hire, pulled Collins aside briefly to ask, with genuine concern, whether everything was all right, and Collins assured him it was, offering nothing more than a grateful nod for the older man's unexpected kindness. In the days leading up to that celebration, Danielle grew increasingly confident that Grace's decision had finally cleared her own path toward meeting Collins Whitmore, a man she still had never seen a single photograph of despite countless hours spent searching every corner of the internet for any trace of him whatsoever. She told Tasha excitedly that her moment had finally arrived, spending an entire weekend shopping for the perfect outfit, one she was certain would leave an unforgettable first impression on a man she had built up in her imagination into something far more glamorous than reality could ever hope to match. Victoria, equally determined not to be caught unprepared, spent her own evenings quietly questioning Rachel and several other longtime staff members for any useful detail about what Collins Whitmore actually looked like, growing visibly more frustrated each time she came up entirely empty-handed despite her considerable persistence. Neither woman noticed the obvious clue sitting directly in front of them throughout those final weeks, that the quiet, watchful janitor who had been working alongside them for over a month had simply stopped needing to search for information about Collins Whitmore at all, for the simple reason that he had never needed to search for himself in the first place. Rachel, sworn to secrecy from the very beginning, found herself biting back a smile on more than one occasion whenever Danielle or Victoria casually mentioned their growing curiosity about the elusive Whitmore heir, knowing full well he had been standing directly beside them in a gray uniform for weeks already. Mr. Dawson, for his part, remained entirely oblivious to the true identity of his newest and most reliably hard-working custodial hire, occasionally praising Eli's work ethic in front of other staff members without ever suspecting the reason behind it. As the celebration drew closer, tension inside the office began building in ways that went beyond simple curiosity about Collins Whitmore's appearance. Whispers spread quickly through the break rooms and hallways about Grace's confession to Charles, with some employees quietly admiring her honesty and others openly questioning her judgment for turning down what appeared to be the opportunity of a lifetime in favor of a relationship with a janitor. Danielle made sure those whispers reached as many ears as possible, framing the story in whatever light most favorably positioned herself as the sensible, ambitious alternative still waiting patiently in the wings. Victoria, meanwhile, grew unusually quiet during this period, watching the unfolding drama from a careful distance while continuing her own private efforts to gather any useful information before the celebration finally arrived. There was one especially tense afternoon during the fourth week when Charles himself walked through the main lobby unannounced, accompanied by two visiting investors he wanted to personally show around the building. And for a brief, uncomfortable moment, father and son passed within a few feet of one another in full view of several employees. Charles kept his expression carefully neutral, nodding once at the janitor mopping near the elevators exactly as he might have nodded at any other member of staff, while Collins kept his own eyes fixed on the floor, his pulse hammering at the sheer improbability of the two of them standing so close together without a single person in that lobby suspecting anything unusual. Later that evening, recounting the moment to Diane over dinner, Charles admitted it had taken every bit of his composure not to smile at his own son, as though nothing at all was out of the ordinary. Danielle and Victoria, who had never been especially close to begin with, grew noticeably colder toward one another as the celebration approached, each privately convinced the other posed the greater threat to whatever future she still believed was within reach. Danielle told Tasha one evening that Victoria's quiet, calculated manner unsettled her far more than any loud rival ever could, because at least with loud people you always knew exactly where you stood. Victoria, for her part, mentioned to no one in particular that she found Danielle's openness about her ambitions almost embarrassing, though she took careful note of every detail Danielle let slip in casual conversation, filing it away for later use should the opportunity ever present itself. Neither woman noticed how closely Rachel was quietly observing both of them throughout this entire period, gathering her own private impressions that she would, months later, share candidly with Charles over coffee. Collins, still working his shifts each day as Eli, found the final stretch before the celebration increasingly difficult to navigate emotionally, aware that every conversation he shared with Grace now carried the weight of a secret he would soon have to reveal to her in front of an entire room full of witnesses. One evening, walking her partway to her car after a shift that had run later than usual, he came dangerously close to telling her the truth outright, the words forming fully in his mind before he ultimately decided against it, wanting instead to honor the plan through to its intended conclusion. Grace, sensing something slightly different in his mood that evening without being able to name exactly what it was, simply told him that whatever he was carrying, she hoped he knew he did not have to carry it entirely alone anymore, a comment that stayed with Collins for the rest of that night and well into the following morning. During that same final week, Grace's mother called from the farm to ask, with the gentle persistence only a mother can manage, whether there was a young man she should know about, having noticed a lightness in her daughter's voice during their recent phone calls that had not been there in quite some time. Grace hesitated before answering, unsure how to explain a relationship that felt entirely real to her while still carrying a secret she herself did not yet know existed, and she told her mother only that there was someone, and that she hoped to bring him home to meet the family before too much longer. Her mother, sensing there was more to the story than her daughter was willing to share over the phone, simply told her to trust her own instincts, reminding her that she had always been a good judge of character for as long as she could remember, even as a little girl choosing her friends carefully on the school playground. Local business journalists had also begun circling the story in the days leading up to the celebration, aware that the retirement of a man as prominent as Charles Whitmore, paired with the long-awaited public debut of his son, made for genuinely compelling coverage regardless of the personal drama unfolding quietly beneath the surface. One reporter, digging slightly deeper than the others, discovered that Collins Whitmore had been noticeably absent from public appearances since returning from London weeks earlier, a detail that struck her as unusual enough to mention in a short preview article, though she had no way of knowing the actual reason behind his absence. Charles read the article the morning it published and allowed himself a rare, private laugh, telling Diane that the truth sitting just beneath that reporter's curiosity was far stranger than anything she could have guessed at from her desk downtown. 2 days before the celebration, Diane insisted on personally reviewing every detail of the evening's arrangements, from the seating chart to the exact moment Collins would step out from behind the curtain, determined that nothing about her son's carefully planned reveal would go wrong after weeks of careful effort. Charles, watching his wife move through the venue with a clipboard in hand, told Rachel quietly that he had not seen Diane this focused on an event since their own wedding decades earlier, and Rachel agreed, adding that she suspected Diane was even more nervous about this evening than either Charles or Collins combined. Collins spent that same evening rehearsing what he might say to Grace once the truth was finally revealed, discarding one version after another until he decided the only honest approach was to simply speak from the heart and let the words come naturally in the moment itself. The celebration itself was held in the company's largest event hall, elaborately decorated for the occasion and filled with employees from every department, longtime business partners, and several members of the local press eager to cover both Charles Whitmore's long-anticipated retirement and the official return of his son to lead the company forward. Grace attended wearing a simple, elegant dress, uncertain exactly what to expect from the evening, having been personally and somewhat mysteriously invited by Charles despite withdrawing from consideration weeks earlier during their private conversation. Danielle arrived considerably more confident, convinced this would finally be the night she met her future. Having spent significant time and money preparing an appearance, she genuinely believed no billionaire's son could possibly overlook once he finally walked through those doors. Neither woman noticed Eli slip quietly out of the main event hall roughly 20 minutes into the evening's proceedings, telling Grace only that he needed to check on something backstage before returning shortly. Diane, watching from near the stage entrance, squeezed her son's hand tightly before he disappeared behind the curtain to change, telling him quietly that whatever happened in the next half hour, she was already proud of the man he had chosen to become throughout this entire unusual experiment. Charles, standing nearby in a freshly pressed suit, simply nodded at his son and told him it was finally time, a phrase that carried far more weight between them than its simple wording suggested to anyone else who might have overheard it in passing. When Charles Whitmore finally took the stage himself, the room fell into an attentive hush that only grew heavier as he began speaking about the 3 women he had personally met with weeks earlier, and about a version of his own son that none of them, aside from Grace in one carefully limited sense, had ever actually met at all. He explained, his voice carrying easily across the silent event hall, that his son had chosen deliberately to enter the company under a different name entirely, with no title and no wealth attached to it whatsoever, in order to discover for himself who among the three women would genuinely love a man for exactly who he was, and absolutely nothing more than that. Danielle's confident smile began to falter somewhere in the middle of that particular sentence, though she could not yet fully articulate why a growing unease had settled so suddenly in her stomach. Charles then asked the room to properly welcome his son for the very first time that evening, and the man who walked onto that stage moments later was not the polished stranger in an unfamiliar suit that everyone in the audience had spent weeks anxiously imagining. It was Eli, still wearing the same steady, watchful expression that had followed him through every hallway and cafeteria table of the past month, though now dressed in a suit that finally matched the name everyone in that room suddenly realized they should have recognized weeks earlier. The room reacted in a wave that started near the front tables and rippled steadily backward through the crowd, gasps overlapping with genuine disbelief as employees who had walked casually past him in hallways for weeks now stared at the exact same familiar face under an entirely different and far more significant name than they had ever known to attach to it. Danielle sat frozen in her seat, the recording she had made weeks earlier suddenly rendering itself meaningless in a way she could never have anticipated when she first captured it, her carefully planned evening collapsing in real time in front of nearly the entire company. Victoria's composed, professional expression cracked visibly for what several longtime coworkers later admitted was the very first time anyone had ever witnessed happen in public. Grace, standing near the back of the hall with her hand pressed instinctively against her mouth, understood in that single frozen instant that the man she had fallen in love with as a struggling janitor, and the man everyone else in that building had spent weeks anxiously chasing as the company's heir had been, this entire time, the exact same person standing directly in front of her. Collins spoke directly to the room once the initial wave of shock had settled somewhat, explaining that he had spent the last several weeks learning something about people that no resume, no interview, and no polished introduction ever could have properly taught him on its own. He told them plainly that character reveals itself most clearly in the small, unremarkable moments when people believe no one important is watching them closely enough to matter. He admitted he had witnessed forms of contempt during that month he would not soon forget, moments that had genuinely disappointed him about his own company's culture, but he had also witnessed forms of kindness he would likely spend the rest of his life trying to properly deserve in return. He then asked Grace to come forward, and in front of every employee, business partner, and journalist gathered in that room, he asked her to marry him, not as the son of Whitmore Industries standing before her in an expensive suit, but as the exact same man she had known simply as Eli for the past several weeks. Grace, still processing everything unfolding rapidly around her, told him through tears that had already begun falling before he even finished asking the question, that she had fallen in love with the man standing in front of her, never once with any name attached to him, and that her honest answer had never depended on which name eventually turned out to be true. The room erupted into applause that seemed to shake the very walls of the event hall. Employees who had barely spoken 2 words to either of them over the years suddenly cheering, as though they had personally witnessed a fairy tale unfold directly in front of their own eyes. Diane, watching from beside her husband, found herself crying openly without any embarrassment whatsoever, thinking of every hard winter she and Charles had survived together decades earlier in that small apartment above the laundromat, and understanding, perhaps for the first time fully, exactly why her husband had insisted on this unusual and risky plan from the very beginning. Before the evening finally came to a close, Charles addressed the room one last time, thanking every single person present for their years of loyalty, and reminding them, in a voice that carried far more genuine weight than any quarterly earnings report he had ever personally delivered, that the way a person treats someone who appears to have nothing meaningful to offer them says absolutely everything about who that person truly is underneath, whatever job title happens to be printed on their business card. He announced, to another wave of enthusiastic applause, that every single member of the company's custodial staff would receive an immediate and substantial increase in pay, a decision he credited directly and publicly to everything his son had personally witnessed, while working quietly alongside them over the preceding month. Mr. Dawson, seated near the back of the hall, nearly dropped his drink in stunned disbelief upon finally learning the true identity of his hardest-working temporary hire. In the weeks that followed the celebration, life at Whitmore Industries slowly settled into a new and quieter rhythm, though the story of that particular evening continued circulating through the company's hallways for months afterward, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling. Danielle, after a period of genuine embarrassment, eventually approached Grace privately to offer a somewhat awkward but sincere apology for her earlier behavior, an apology Grace accepted graciously, having never been one to hold onto resentment longer than necessary. Victoria remained at the company as well, though colleagues noticed a subtle but genuine shift in her demeanor over the following months, as though the public unraveling of her carefully maintained composure had, in its own strange way, finally allowed her to relax into something closer to her actual self. Collins officially assumed his role as chief executive of Whitmore Industries shortly after the celebration, guided quietly through his early decisions by a father who remained close by as an advisor, without ever attempting to overshadow his son's growing authority within the company. Grace, after some careful thought, eventually accepted a promotion into a senior marketing role she had genuinely earned through her own consistent work long before anyone in that building knew the janitor she had befriended was actually destined to become her boss. Diane, true to her word months earlier, wasted no time reminding her son at every family dinner that she still fully expected grandchildren sooner rather than later, a comment that reliably made Collins laugh and Grace blush in equal measure each, and every time it came up around the table. The following spring, Collins and Grace were married in a modest ceremony held on the same farm where Grace had grown up, a choice Grace insisted on, and Collins fully supported, wanting the day to reflect exactly who they both were rather than what the Whitmore name might have suggested it should look like. Diane cried through nearly the entire ceremony, and Charles, standing beside his son as best man, quietly told him beforehand that Diane had cried at their own wedding 30-odd years earlier too, and that some things, it seemed, simply ran in the family regardless of how much money eventually came along with them. Mr. Dawson attended as well, seated proudly near the front at Collins's personal invitation, still occasionally shaking his head in disbelief whenever he remembered mopping floors alongside the same man now standing at the altar. Rachel served, at Grace's insistence, as one of the ceremony's readers, and she later admitted to Diane over cake that keeping the secret for that entire month had been one of the hardest and most rewarding assignments of her 15 years with the company. Even Danielle sent a card, brief and a little awkward in its wording, wishing the couple well and thanking Grace, somewhat unexpectedly, for teaching her something about honesty she said she was still working on learning fully herself. Grace and Collins settled into a quiet house not far from the farm where she had grown up, deliberately choosing a life that looked, from the outside, considerably more modest than their combined resources would have suggested was necessary. Collins continued running Whitmore Industries with the same attentiveness he had once brought to mopping the lobby floors, regularly walking the building's lower levels to check in with custodial and maintenance staff, a habit that puzzled newer executives until they eventually learned the story behind it. Grace, now leading the marketing department she had once worked within as a junior associate, made a point of mentoring young employees who reminded her of herself years earlier, quiet and hardworking, and easily overlooked by anyone not paying close enough attention. Years later, when new employees joined Whitmore Industries and heard some version of the story during their first week of orientation, it had already taken on the polished, slightly exaggerated shape that memorable company legends eventually acquire over time, though the essential truth at its center remained exactly as it had always been. A man who could have walked into any room in that building demanding respect had instead chosen, deliberately and at real personal risk, to walk in demanding nothing at all, simply to discover which people would choose to offer him kindness anyway. In the end, the lesson Charles Whitmore had hoped his son would learn proved true well beyond that single celebration night, echoing quietly through every new hire who ever heard the story and paused, if only briefly, to consider how they themselves treated the people around them who appeared, on the surface, to have nothing at all to offer them in return. Diane, in her later years, often told the story to her grandchildren exactly the way she remembered living it, without the exaggerations the office version had gradually accumulated over time, reminding them that their grandfather had once split a single can of soup with her in a cold apartment above a laundromat, and that their father had once mopped floors for a month simply to prove that love, real love, never needed a fortune to recognize itself. She would tell them that the world rewards people who chase money loudly and visibly, but that it remembers, far longer and far more meaningfully, the people who choose kindness quietly, when no one important is supposedly watching at all. It was, she liked to say, the truest inheritance either she or Charles had ever managed to pass down, worth considerably more than anything printed on a company balance sheet, and one she hoped would outlast every building the Whitmore name would ever be attached to. Collins himself, whenever asked years later by curious employees or the occasional journalist why he had risked so much on a single unusual month, gave the same simple answer every time. He said that most people spend their whole lives wondering whether they are loved for who they are or for what they have, and that he had simply decided once to remove every possible doubt before it was too late to matter. He never regretted the decision, not on the hardest days running a company that demanded more of him than he had ever anticipated, and not on the countless ordinary evenings that followed, sitting across the dinner table from the same woman who had once brought a struggling janitor a burger during his lunch break, expecting nothing whatsoever in return. And so the story of Whitmore Industries continued, told and retold across boardrooms and break rooms alike, not merely as a company history, but as a quiet reminder that fortunes rise and fall, titles change hands, and buildings are eventually replaced by newer ones. But the way a person treats another human being when they believe no reward is coming remains, in the end, the only measure of character that truly lasts. Somewhere in that building, decades later, a new employee still occasionally paused near the lobby elevators, having just heard the story for the first time, and glanced a little differently at whoever happened to be mopping the floor nearby, wondering, if only for a moment, whether they were looking at exactly who they appeared to be.